Oh, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Francois, for the kind invitation, and the staff, everyone that I don't know, but that is instrumental for the people to be here to share this conference with you. They gave me the opportunity as well to be with Nuria, that, as she mentioned, we were colleagues decades ago, and we noticed that we are sharing this table only 4 or 5 days ago, so it was a nice and beautiful surprise. So, in front of the work of Teresa Margolles, we cannot but realize that Mexico is facing a painful reality, and Nuria expresses that in a very concrete way. But paradoxically, in many of her installations, we are not impelled to experience pain or repulsion in our own body, but rather to experience a sense of dislocation. Homicides, feminicides, enforced disappearances, organized crimes, and extrajudicial executions inhabit her world. However, something seems to be missing all the time. An impressive catalog of items related to death, murder, and violence are there, except something: actual corpses. We can find parts of the body, fluids, footprints, odors, inscriptions, or any other form of indexical human remains, but never a corpse as such. Trained in criminal forensics, her strategy is to deal with the materiality of violence and death, implying but never representing the missing body. In her work, the body as a trace of mass violence is presented in absentia. In this way, Margolles turns absence into a political and aesthetic territory, a territory composed of spectral experiences. Take, for example, her installation, Sounds of Death, that is today exhibited in Mexico in front of one of the pieces that is in this museum inside. A series of audio recordings of acoustic landscapes were made where female corpses were found. What characterizes these murders is that the forensic department officially categorized them as feminicides. However, the collected sounds have nothing to do with noises produced during the examination or transportation of bodies. Actually, what we are invited to hear has no material connection with those bodies. They are just and simply echoes of their absence. Some specialists and experts in the work of Teresa Margolles argue that there is an inverse correlation between the aestheticization of violence in the public sphere in Mexico, for instance, when cartels use dead bodies as statements of power, territory, or fear, and the radicalization of the minimalistic aesthetics in her installations. And I prefer to use minimal aesthetics rather than abstraction, because I think there's a great difference between them. Could be confusion there. The hypothesis suggests that the so-called war on drugs, bombastically declared in 2006 by ex-President Felipe Calderón, not only galvanized the presence of corpuses operating as statements in the streets, but also forced artists in Mexico to find non-representational alternative ways to deal with brutality, violence, and bloody crimes. What is at stake here is, of course, the potential incapacity or the capacity of the image to produce empathy, compassion, and awareness in visual arenas saturated with the material presence of horror. And yesterday, in a couple of the presentations, people talk about this, the fatigue or the exhaustion of the images in the capacity to instantiate moral imperatives. And the argument is not that they cannot provide this empathy because they lack reality or contact with reality, but rather because they are real in excess. This is the argument that Jacques Rancière provides in his book, The Intolerability of the Image. Right? He mentioned described this as a regime of visual complicity that is exhausted. For those of you familiarized with the history of modern philosophy or political philosophy or moral philosophy, it is easy to recognize here the collapse of two different Western traditions: empiricism, associated with David Hume, and what could be described as the imperative rational morality, following the vocabulary of German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And we don't have too much time to enter into this discussion, but just let me illustrate this tension between these strategies with these two installations. This is Sala Oscura de Tortura, the dark chamber of torture of 1972 by the group Denuncia, including Julio Leparc and Juan Guanaques Neto, Alexandro Marco, and Jose Gamarra. This installation was a hexagon in which we are invited to get inside and to see scenes of the torture that this Fray Tito experienced because of the Brazilian dictatorship. And the idea there is to feel literally, to be in the place of the one that was tortured. Well, this is the idea of using senses as to provoke a sense of empathy or a synesthetic association with torture. Let me just show you a couple of examples. So imagine the idea is to produce a feeling of fear surrounded by these paintings or representations of torture. Of course, it's just a case of something that we see every day, the idea of producing the sense of the tragedy, the representation of the horror, as to convoke the spectator to be in compassion with. On the other side, we have examples as this Luis Kemnitzer installation of 1969. He was invited to give to produce a show in Santiago de Chile, and in the way to Chile, he read in a diary that an execution of some farmers in the suburban area in Chile, and he decided to talk about that and to denounce this massacre. But the way he did is precisely avoiding any sort of representation of violence. We can see any body, no blood, no torture, but rather the forensic strategy to produce the massacre, right? What is at stake, of course, is the problem of are our senses the original source for producing a morality, a collective morality, or we need something else that is translating that original resources in order to even contradict them, as Immanuel Kant said, so that we can create imperative categories. Let me just show you a couple of images of that installation, which was reenacted some years ago. It's just the nomination of people involved in the murder, right? Trajectories of bullets, etc. Extending the hypothesis of the inverse correlation between non-representational artistic practices and the oversaturation of images in the public sphere, I am interested in examining to what extent the exhumation of hundreds of bodies recently found in clandestine graves in Mexico impact the strategies used by artists such as Margolles and institutions such as the memory museums or so-called site of conscience In particular, I'm interested in collective artistic practices dealing with spectrality, phantasmagoria, and disappearance, such as Bordando por la Paz, Embroidering for Peace, or the Museum of Memory and Tolerance, launched by the Jewish community in Mexico in 2010, projects that emerged as a result of the humanitarian crisis, with the idea to give answer to these issues. This is just an image. Maybe you know the problem that happened in today's Memory Museum in the 9/11 New York Memorial. Before that building was constructed, the idea was to produce the so-called International Freedom Center. Maybe you heard about that. It was an impressive tower that they wanted to construct there. And the idea of this tower was to talk about the international idea of freedom, right? This messianic idea of the United States to produce a global sense of taking care, right? But paradoxically, the local community rejected and claimed against this project, right? But in today's museum, is actually inside the museum the forensic laboratory of the victims associated with the tragic events of 9/11. And this is a demonstration of family members and relatives saying that human remains do not belong in museums because they have to get inside a museum in order to murder, in order to view it, right, in order to have an empathy reconciliation with their lost. Now, since the goal of forensic excavations is to find evidence and to use the material presence of human remains for different purposes such as prosecution, restitution, and mourning, it is not exaggerated to say that exhumations come together with the articulation of what could be described as extractive memories, the implication being that in one way or another, forensic excavations remove land, and in doing so, they disrupt the effective topography of our social memories. In fact, the very title of this conference, Topographies of Mass Violence, suggests or invited me to think in a geoepistemological displacement, to weave together the double meaning of the root topos as it appears in the very concept of topography. Topos, as you know, is a place, a territory, a location on Earth. But topos is also the subject of a speech. And I think yesterday Emanuel talked a little bit on that. Right? Topos is also a subject of a speech, the thematic structure of a literary story, and the very architecture of our speech acts. Combined, these two meanings evoke the idea of a place from which we can tell and in which we can wave or inscribe our social memories. In other words, topos is a locus of enunciation. From this point of view, the massive emergence of human remains dislocates not only the geography of pain, but also the visual arena in which the right to see for ourselves and the right to know the truth become a literal struggle to the death with institutional impunity, administrative erasure of evidence, and social memory suppressions. This is why I argue that the scopic regime of violence in Mexico is reaching nowadays a point of inflection. In fact, the very idea of the right to look proposed by Nicholas Merzoff evokes or emphasizes a series of visual technologies fully embedded in our forensic imaginaries. And also this morning and yesterday, people talk about this visual imaginary of the forensic techniques. Just let me say that etymologically, forensics has to do with a forum, with a public space, right? Forensis, place for the assembly. It's a place for making decisions, to join together, to see, and have a public dialogical opinion. In the same way, autopsy means literally a witnessing, right? To see something with your own eyes. To excavate, when talking about post-mortem autopsy, to excavate the body in order to determine the causes of the death. Evidence is as well to show clarity, to give proof, to offer clarity to the viewer. So everything has to do with this ocular regime of forensic technologies. Visuality then plays an important role in the way, in what I call the performative dimension of human rights, that is, the embodied discourses used by institutions in order to make sense of abstract ideas such as justice, truth, freedom, humanity, or restitution. I am using here the expression making sense literally, alluding to our capacity to give shape to the world with our senses. And just let me show you some images of this famous exhibition of 1949, when established our modern idea of human rights. And they produced an exhibition because they were very concerned of how are we going to make that people believe and share some kind of common values around human rights, things that we today probably assume that are everywhere, but they were concerned to produce this exhibition in Paris. And together with the exhibition, they produced some kind of portfolio, a traveling exhibition, because they wanted to make easy for everyone in a little town in Asia or in Latin America to have the opportunity to show these images and to evoke these images as a kind of global cosmopolitan idea of human rights, which is part of the contradictions that were mentioned in the previous table, right? This agonistic idea of human rights, right? In which human and rights are both confusing and problematic terms, right? The keynote speaker very clearly expresses the problem of the foundational moment in which the very idea of the human was produced with colonization and was produced with the controversy between Bartolomé de las Casas and Sepúlveda, discussing if they wanted to accept the new people that they look similar, but accepting them as humans implied, for example, that they cannot make illegal war, right? Because they were human, they were part of the plan, right? So the controversy is also twofold, because of course we know that Bartolomé de las Casas is the great defender of this humanitarian dimension of the new peoples. But the problem is that the way in which Bartolomé de las Casas accepted that humanity was as in the lower level of humanism, right? They are humans, but they are in the lower scale of humanity, which colonialism is exactly an machinery that uses this hierarchy in order to operate and reproduce itself. That's what the colonial theorists describe as coloniality of power, as a different thing as colonialism. Right? So let me just show you some images of how they wanted to produce some kind of commonality between different peoples around the globe. Right? Everyone has family, they say. Everyone needs to eat. Everyone needs a place to join together, right? Everyone dresses. Everyone, and this is of course problematic, everyone has whatever you want to call writing law. Yeah. Of course, in this idea of commonality, they are invisibilizing, erasure of different patterns of culture. There was an exhibition, I'm going to show you the portfolio now. Together with the portfolio, with the traveling portfolio in Paris, they sell this kind of dispositive, right, as to make sense of a visual cosmopolitan connection between cross-cultural territories, and they create this kind of eye. which you can see inside the globe. So it's a metaphor of an eye, right? The problem of an eye, if we're talking about visual culture, is that the eye can see everything except itself, right? You need a mirror in order to see your own eye. Right? So they wanted this idea of self-other construction through visual technologies. And of course, inside was a kind of an abstract idea of humans, slaves, educated people, or educational pedagogies, right? Culture, institutions, and so on and so forth. And look at this. The very idea of humankind that they produced was a Renaissance idea of male-female distribution of gender, right? So this is the portfolio, right? Actually, beyond the controversial idea, the idea of the portfolio is very interesting as a traveling something, right? That you can just take and exhibit in it. Now, echoing the well-known book by Jacques Derrida, Specters of Marx, I entitled this short presentation, Spectral Topographies, my appropriation of hauntology, a concept coined by Derrida to call into question the ontological architecture of our discourses, allows me to characterize massive enforced disappearances as a sort of a spectral violence inflicted on the social body as a whole. In my view, this specific kind of mass violence is fully connected with the right to know, the politics of truth, and collective traumas derived from the disappearance of civilians. Unlike other forms of state terror or terrorism, spectral violence impacts the social body indirectly, using the phantasmagorical presence of disappeared bodies as an instrument for its own incarnation and somatic reproduction. In Mexico, officially and non-official circulation of statistics concerning enforced disappearances and extrajudicial executions have been systematically used as delusive rhetorical or political instruments, actively participating in the production of governmental violence against civil society. Let me summarize this story and the dimension of the problem. In 2015, the president of the Mexican Commission for Human Rights, Luis González Pérez, appeared in court in front of the CAD, the United Nations Committee of Enforced Disappearances. The motive of this allegation had to do with the Ayotzinapa affair of 2014, the traumatic event that made visible a major accountability issue, that Mexico has never had trustable records and statistics of massive disappearances related to organized crime and government violence against civilians. Systematically, and I would say symptomatically, every single institution or juridical instrument created in this country to collect information and prosecute individuals or groups operates de facto as an obstacle to this goal, suppressing social memories and allowing the destruction of criminal evidence. The emblematic case of this is the so-called Special Prosecutor Office for Political and Social Movements of the Past, FEMOS, by the initials in Spanish, an institution created by ex-President Vicente Fox in 2001 for prosecuting cases related to the Mexican Dirty War, the 60s, 70s, and 80s period. Dissolved 5 years later, this organism resolved none of the 570 accusations and was instrumental in eliminating categories such as enforced disappearance and genocide from the institutional vocabulary. This is why the report delivered in Geneva by the Luis González Pérez commissioner was in fact a sort of accusation, a sort of confession. And I quote, "At this point," he said, "we cannot provide a clear and trustable statistics. We need first to establish a better articulation between federal government and local entities and to use an accurate methodology in order to verify data," unquote. And he was actually right. In Mexico, numbers of disappeared people have always been and still are today controversial. For instance, when current President Enrique Peña Nieto was elected in 2012, the official number of disappearances was 26,000. A couple of months later, as a result of what he called an actualization of the national records of missing and disappeared people, that number was decreased to 19,000. This means 7,000 less than a couple of months before. In 2014, the numbers of disappearances experienced a new and this time dramatic modification because they start to talk about only 8,000. An unrealistic number, of course, which was rectified 6 months later when the president started to talk again to 23 to 24,000. The institutional volatility of these numbers drastically reduces their legitimacy. So much so that by 2015, the federal government naturalized the use of two official but contradicting databases. One of them reported only 4,000 cases between 2006 and 2014, whereas the other reported 25,000 in a shorter period of time, that is between 2006 and 2012. I'm sorry of these numbers, but it's like a rhetorics of terror. Right? In addition to this obvious inconsistency, any of them was accompanied by a concise juridical definition of the concept enforced disappearance, which is a conceptual and philosophical problem, but also a juridical issue. And even worse, any of them presented a standardized geographical, criminal, or forensic information, turning this data almost useless. Following the 14 recommendations issued in 2015 by the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United States, the Mexican Records of Missing Disappearing People institution established last year a new official number of disappearances. This is 29,917, which has been ratified by international organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. As you can see, 30,000 disappearances is similar to the estimation of kidnappings during the Argentinian Dirty War. It's the number provided by the Madres de Plaza de Mayo, and 3 times the official number of disappearances officially accepted by the Argentinian military representatives. Considering the high level of impunity in Mexico, the state terror governing over everyday life, and the absence of juridical instruments protecting and repairing victims, it is understandable that the vast majority of cases never reach the court as formal accusations, and it is with no surprise that independent organizations and associations of relatives of disappeared people in Mexico consider this new official number a rhetorical underestimation. As you probably are aware of, only 3 weeks ago, the port city of Veracruz experienced the spectral emergence of 10,000 human remains as a result of a self-organized exhumation promoted and financed by family members affected by the case of systemic disappearances in the region. In this new clandestine graveyard, located only 9 miles from downtown Veracruz, they found 253 full corpses of male and female individuals between 14 and 25 years old. The terrain has not been fully excavated yet, but forensic specialists talk of the largest clandestine cemetery in Latin America. In front of this situation, we need to reconsider the role of social memories, spontaneous artistic demonstration, and visual culture in the collective, as I say, de-somatization of violence and governmental spectral violence in a specific, which, as I said, includes impunity and the lack of proper juridical instruments to deal with a situation of this scale. Let me just conclude by mentioning briefly 2 antagonistic examples of reactions in front of this humanitarian crisis. One of them is the Museo de la Memoria y Tolerancia, an institutional strategy, of course, and the other one is Bordando por la Paz, embroidering for peace, and a spontaneous and decentralized collective demonstration, mostly promoted by women. I have just a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to give you an idea of what is at stake with these two examples. This museum is located in a complex of institutions that were relocated in this central area in downtown Mexico City. Is the Supreme Court of Justice and the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs. The three buildings create a complex of the legalization of the state of right, as they say, Estado de Derecho, of the new Peña Nieto government. These are the two other ones. And the museum is very controversial because I don't know if you know about it, you hear about the existence of this museum, but the museum was launched by the Jewish community, so it's divided into three different levels. The first one, the most important one, is the memory section, which is basically a huge experience with the Holocaust as the ground zero of genocide or mass violences. And then you have this sensual political idea of being with the suffering of the Jewish community, using traditional photographs, reconstruction of ghettos. We have the original transportation of corpses to the extermination camps, and etc. Just to give an idea of what is in this museum. Once you cross this big area, it's really like 65% of the museum, you enter into a intersection there that is another kind of genocides that are connected with the Holocaust, but the people in museum, in memory studies say multi-directional memories. They establish the Holocaust as the main core of genocide, and they talk about other genocide using this metaphor to talk about them, which implies a problem there that is a hierarchy or the capacity to talk or not talk about minor situations, but also problematic situations. Then they have the Armenian, you have the Yugoslavia, and you have Guatemala, you have Darfur, you have a bunch of experiences of nunca más, no more genocide experiences. I have, of course, a whole talking about the construction of this, La Corte Penal Internacional. And once we cross this area, you get into this kind of, it's very Kantian idea of morality, because you get into a transparent box, like a cube, right? It's produced by an artist, Jan Hendricks, that is called Lament, and is a metaphor of tears of children, victims of genocides. And you have this kind of reflective mirror of multiple transparencies that invite us to clean our minds, right? We have this moral condensation of what we just saw before, and then we cross this box that is suspended on air, literally, like think on your brain or your skull, and inside is this kind of a main core of morality. This is how Kant describes this idea. I'm sorry, I'm just finishing. And then when we cross that, we pass to the next section, is a section of tolerance. And in this section of tolerance that we have is an idea that in Mexico, what we have is a permanent awareness of the preservation of tolerance, human rights, and etc. So you can imagine that, by the way, they use Emanuel Licha to talk about tolerance. And for those of you who read Levinas, he's whatever except a philosopher of tolerance, right? His humanitarian of the other is literally saying that the self is not an existent, a previous existence before taking care of others, right? So this is the opposite of tolerance. Whatever, you have a different sections talking about how in Mexico we have an amazing diversity and we have an amazing preoccupations, institutions dealing with wishes of indigenous peoples, of whatever, right? And there's another section that is temporary exhibitions. For 7 years or so, 6 or 7 years or so, they never talk about the major problems in Mexico, right? This is the current exhibition to date, and Teresa Margolles has a contribution to this show. But before that, the feminicide was invisible. What I want to say with this example is that sometimes you can use genocide, exemplary visual displays in order to invisibilize all the problems that people actually have in the everyday life. Right? So the criticism that this museum received 4 or 3 years ago was so huge, so direct, that they really shift the direction, and now they start to talk and to construct a different kind of stories. I'm going to stop here, and thank you.